Hey guys, this is Luke Johnson and Robert Schut. Welcome to our penultimate discussion of Soren Kierkegaard's 18 Upbuilding Discourses. Robert will be leading this discussion on the 17th Upbuilding Discourse. And I guess I won't steal his thunder, and I'll just let him teach what he's going to teach. Thank you, Robert.
Well, good morning. Yes, this discourse is about cowardliness in Kierkegaard's terms. So it's going to spend most of the time trying to get an idea of what he means by cowardliness. And it's kind of a cowardliness in the religious sense, I think, is where we're going with this. To start off, he quotes a scripture like he has, I think, in every discourse so far. He gives us something from 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7. But I'm going to read the verse before it and the verse after it so we can get a little context for it. So that it doesn't just kind of sit there without any context. For which cause I put thee in remembrance, that thou stir up the gift of God, which is in thee through the laying on of my hands. For God gave us not a spirit of fearfulness, but of power and love and discipline. Be not ashamed, therefore, of the testimony of our Lord, nor of me his prisoner, but suffer hardship with the gospel according to the power of God. Now, I thought, Luke, most people probably don't know what it means in Scripture when you quote something from 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, 1 John, 2 John. You know, a lot of times people will assume that the name is the name of the writer, but this isn't always the case. In the case of Timothy, 1 and 2 Timothy, these are letters that Paul wrote to Timothy, advising him. So who was Timothy then? Well, a little background on Timothy is that he was from Asia Minor, which is today Turkey. His mother was Jewish, but his father was a Greek, meaning he wasn't really a Christian, wasn't really a Jew. Timothy traveled a lot with Paul, and Paul would kind of give him assignments. Like he was like a church troubleshooter. He would go out to some of the churches that had problems, and he would try to figure out if he could resolve some of those issues. This happened, to give you an idea of the time, about the mid-50s of the first century. Timothy, what unusual thing, and kind of sets Timothy out from some of the others, is that he was circumcised as an adult, as a Christian. And this had started a little controversy as far as, well, wait, I thought the agreement was Christians didn't have to be circumcised. But the difference is Timothy was circumcised because it made it easier for Paul and Timothy to go among the Jews, because that was a big issue during Paul's lifetime here, whether you should be circumcised or not. So he felt it was better so that he could win more Jews to the gospel if Timothy was circumcised. It would, stop a lot of issues before they would begin. So the real reason he was circumcised wasn't to become a member of the church. It was simply to make his evangelism a little easier among the Jews. Paul trusted Timothy so much that it said that he is maybe co-wrote some of the letters, or at least he participated in some of the letters to one degree or another. And in what they call the apocryphal Acts of Timothy, which is like a book called the Acts of Timothy, it's not a book that's been canonized, but it's a book that we can at least glean some history from it. It says that Timothy was stoned to death by the pagans around the year 97. So that gives you a little background on Timothy. I figured we could use this time to bring people up to speed in case they were interested in some of the background.
I think that's fantastic that you brought that background into it. I'm kind of curious, do you know the reason why it was excluded from the canon?
Usually they're excluded because they don't really contain history that pertains to the gospel itself, or that the Gospels or that these books are obviously either fake or that they're questionable to one degree or another. So it's usually a credibility issue, or just merely the fact that it doesn't really involve the gospel so much. It's just a background, a history of certain things that may have happened that really they felt didn't need to be in the canon, in the Bible, of books that are considered to be inspired by God. So it's books that are worthwhile, they're worth reading. It's just that the people who canonized them didn't feel that they were really inspired by God, so there was no that kind of truth in them.
So it's not so much that Timothy would have been a text that was in error, meaning that it was a lie perpetuated or something like that, right. but maybe it contained information that was extraneous to the message of the gospel.
Yeah, there were, people don't realize that there were thousands of books at that time, thousands of writings at that time that they had to go through to decide, well, which ones are canonized, which ones should we canonize? And most of them are kind of obvious that they're just people writing off the top of their head. They're not really historical. They're not really spiritual. So most of them it was pretty easy. Some of them were a little bit more difficult. The book of Revelation had a little difficulty getting into to be canonized at one time. But we're kind of left with what is considered now the canonized versions.
So, and we need to talk about Kierkegaard, but I'm really fascinated by this idea.
Okay.
Yeah, but those books that just got excluded, like those, like the Acts of Timothy you reference as one that didn't make the canon or something like that, and
yeah,
it seems like there's like a lot that's contained within the apocryphal text. It seems like stuff that barely made it, and then stuff that's just really wild and should have no closeness to the gospel.
Yeah.
Is there a name for those books that almost made it but were deemed extraneous but not also outright lies?
Yeah,
or is that the
yeah,
word?
It's called the Deuterocanon is one. Deuterocanon means it's like a second canon. They weren't worthy of being in the first canon, but they're not so bad that we shouldn't read them. There's some truth in them, and so those were called the Deuterocanon.
Okay, so you had used the word Deuterocanon before in one of our conversations. I kind of just nodded and smiled, like, oh yeah, I've totally heard that word before. But Deuterocanon essentially means second canon, right?
Yeah.
It's
pretty good, right? That's Deutero meaning second. So
yeah. What else is in the Deuterocanon besides the Acts of Timothy?
Oh well, if you look at a Roman Catholic Bible, you'll see the First and Second Maccabees. Oh boy, what else is in there? The Tobit. There's a bunch of books that you've probably never read before. I've taken a look at it. I've read some of them. I think it was the Book of Wisdom, and some of them are pretty good. I mean, they're worth, like they say, they're worth reading. It's just that it's not something that you can quote and feel confident that, the whole church agrees that this is, spiritually inspired by God. But
that's where it came up is the Book of Wisdom, because Kierkegaard referenced the Book of Wisdom in one of the earlier Upbuilding Discourses, and either I or you labeled it within the Deuterocanon. And he's particularly fond of that one. I don't.
Yeah. As am I. I really like it myself too. I think it's a beautiful book.
Someone should put together an audio Deuterocanon.
There you go.
It exist.
I don't know. Sounds like a project.
Sounds like a project. Okay, I'll let you proceed.
Okay, that's okay. Interrupt at any time, because I'm sure some of the other people listening might have the same questions. So I'll do my best to answer them without preparation. So hopefully I'm accurate. So we talk, but he's talking about here about not the whole paragraph that I read, but he's speaking only of one verse here, and I'll reread that verse so we know which one is kind of bolded here. For God gave us not a spirit of fearfulness, but a power and love and discipline. So what Paul is telling us here, not Kierkegaard, he's kind of giving us an application of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. So the gifts of the Holy Spirit are something a little different, but this is more of an application of God's gifts. How can we use those gifts? How do they help us? Well, they create in us power, love, and discipleship. So that's kind of the beginning, and that's the verse that we're going to use here that we should kind of keep in the background of our mind here as we go through the rest of this. Because the rest of this, Luke, is really about one of my favorite subjects, that's why I'm really excited about this particular discourse, is because it talks about resolution. And resolution is really a commitment. And I think he really nails this here. He starts off with a question, and this is very much like Kierkegaard. Is there a power that can take over a person that will make him forget about nobility and sacredness and make him a slave to worldly affairs? And if there were, such a power would increase our separation from God until we have a total alienation of him. So he starts out asking us, is there something we need to watch out for? Even believers, he says. It's possible, he says, that this can even happen to someone who's strong in the faith. People may start out strong in faith, and then slowly they become more critical, until eventually they get to the point where they don't believe anymore. Whether it's justified or not isn't really the issue here, but whether or not it can happen to somebody who starts out with strong faith is what Kierkegaard is going to deal with. And he says, well, how does a person in faith protect himself from this delusion or this distortion? One way to prevent this is by making a resolution. And the reason is, he says, it because the resolution joins us to the eternal. It brings the timeless into time and brings us out of uniformity and habit. Many times, at least I've experienced it, and I'm assuming I'm a decent sample of humanity, that we get in a rut. We get habits. And when I say this, I mean bad habits, usually. The only way to get out of these habits is to make a resolution. Usually when we hear the word resolution, we think of New Year's resolutions. And that's okay, because that's about what it's like. We make a resolution maybe to eat better. We make a resolution to get more exercise, maybe to pay more attention to our children or to be better children or whatever it is. We usually start out the year as a good time to start out the year with a good resolution. Of course, we can do it any time of the year. We don't have to wait for New Year's Day. But a good example of a good resolution is like AA. A person joins AA. They've got bad habits. They may be drinking too much alcohol, or maybe it's NA. They've got drug abuse. And they've got these habits that they created, and they want to get rid of those habits. So NA and AA is great for that they start out with a resolution. You've got to want to make this change, and you've got to follow it habitually. But even then, there are failures. So the resolution itself doesn't guarantee success. One thing to consider is how many people, I'll bet the membership of the gyms the first of the year probably go up really high. People are deciding, I need to get more exercise, so I'll join a gym. But just because you have a membership card doesn't make you healthier. It doesn't build muscles. You've got to go to the gym, and you've got to work out 3 times a week maybe in order to improve your health. And that's what a resolution is like. And that's kind of what Kierkegaard is going to discuss here. So he says there's like a misunderstanding here of a resolution. Many tell us that a resolution only takes place in a moment and then it's finished. It's kind of, he likens it to jumping into water. I guess jumping into cold water, a swimming pool, right? So you're standing there on the edge of the pool and you know the water's cold and you're saying, oh, I got to do this here. All the girls are watching, you know, and I got to make a good impression. And so you jump in and you get it over with and that's it. It's done. All the hard work is done. And he said that's what people think a resolution is like. He says it's really based upon the decision. So it's this type of a momentary commitment that almost makes it appear that we're doing something heroic. You know, I guess when you're standing on the edge of the pool or the edge of the cliff and you're ready to jump in, you want all the girls to watch. So you want them to think you're a hero. And so there's something heroic about that first moment that you dive into the water. And here he may be implying, and we got to keep in mind his context, Kierkegaard's context. He may be implying something about the church here and the initial commitment to join the church. This could be with the reference to jumping into the water, might be a reference to baptism or an altar call. I don't know if people might not be familiar with what an altar call is. An altar call is like if you've ever watched Billy Graham at the stadiums, at the end, he gives a call and he says, those people who want to convert, those people who want to make a decision, come on down. And of course, thousands of people come down every week. That's an altar call. Not to judge or determine the validity of it, but just saying that's what it is. It's that one-time decision process.
What do you say something? Yeah, I was going to say, ever since I was a little kid, that, you know, I grew up in a Protestant church, and there was always this encouragement from the congregation, the pastor, and everybody else to say, well, if anyone has been in the congregation today and felt themselves moved by the Holy Spirit, you just come up to the altar, right, and whatever, and you can be saved today. And ever since I was a little child, that never added up to me. I don't know if it all did it always strike you as strange? I can only imagine that Soren would find that strange within our evangelical communities too. Like, okay, cool. Like I did this public faith profession. Good. Got that out of the way. Check it off. We're good to go.
No, I agree. Yes. I think that's what he's thinking about. Maybe they did that during his time. Did I find it strange? Not the first time I experienced it, but when I kept going back week after week and I saw the same people getting up week after week going down, I began to question it.
Well, I think one of the reasons why I love Kierkegaard is that I think he I'm noticing here. I'm saying like, oh, this has always bothered me since I was a child. Part of the reason, it was interesting when I was at like a conventional university. We would have people come in for positions that we'd hire, and they would, you know, they'd be scholars on Aristotle or Spinoza or whatever, and they could spin this magical sort of theory of the person that they were well versed in. And then I always found it very interesting. I would always ask, well, do you believe it? Is it true? And then they would hesitate on that. And what I'm trying to say here is that with Kierkegaard, a lot of it really resonates with like my personal live experience that I've been engaged with since a very young age. It always struck me as very odd to think about something as personal as faith being something that you can get up and attest to in front of a religious community, and therefore you were like saved or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's the attraction. Yeah, Kierkegaard seems to be about, but he's writing about them, so it's like we get to see our thoughts out loud and experience them. And I think that's one of the real beauties of Kierkegaard. He was such a deep thinker that he wasn't afraid to reveal those thoughts, like, hey, if you want to think I'm crazy, fine, but this is what I think. And so that's why I think people like you and myself kind of resonate with him and harmonize with him. So he says here that if it were true that resolutions were just instantaneous, he said it would be really easy to make lofty resolutions and create ourselves kind of in this heroic figure idea. He speaks here also about a theatrical element to this kind of resolution, where the admiration of the crowd is very important. Making these resolutions in front of people and having people pat us on the back and say, hey, welcome to the group, welcome to the club, you're one of us now. That he says this is really a big thing, a big element of a resolution for some people. Then he brings the devil into this. But this is, of course, Kierkegaard's devil is not the pitchfork with the pointy tail. Kierkegaard's devil is the devil of distortion and delusion. So we want to think of it in that manner. He says he knows that the devil uses many of his acts to deceive. And that actually is the devil really means the word to deceive. So he's the deceiver, means the devil. And distorting the resolution is only one way that the devil acts upon us. We therefore have to be very careful when we make a resolution. It's not instantaneous, but it's progressive. We make great decisions. It's true, there is a moment where we do make the resolution, but the resolution isn't over merely at the end of the decision. It's the beginning. So whether we deliberate over it or think about it, eventually we make that choice. But again, that choice is only the beginning of this progression. Many are deceived into thinking that the danger lies, that there's a danger anyway, that lies in making a resolution. But the danger isn't in the leap itself. The danger of the Christian leap takes place during the process of salvation. So it's not whether or not, there's no danger whether or not you want to go down and be close to Billy Graham, or whether you want to respond to the altar call. There's no real danger there. The danger is, hey, can you live up to that resolution? Can you follow through with it? Or is this going to be week after week, you simply have to just make the same resolution over and over and over again? So that's what he's going to deal with here. He says we're conceived in sin, and in the process of salvation then is really where the danger lies. This is when we have to face our temptations and the revelations of who we are. We face the danger of failure as well to complete that process. Making an instantaneous decision, you don't have to worry about the process. You don't have to worry about failure because it's such a small time period that there's no time for failure. But the commitment that begins and requires a lifetime of commitment opens you up to failure. And so that's really where the fear lies. So many might think here, well, I'm saved now, so what else is there? And that's one of the dangers I think we face in the church. The focus is so much on the moment of salvation that they forget you've got now a whole lifetime of salvation to live out. What do I do now? How do I follow through with this? So he says it's perverse to actually promise someone that the mere taking of the leap is something heroic. And, it's true that in a church, baptism and commitment, people can pat you on the back and they get together and they pray and all this. That's part of the elements of that. But we don't want people to think that that's where it ends, that that's the moment of heroism, that your whole life, in a sense, is going to be heroic now, or should be. It's more of a humble frame of mind or an experience to admit that people are sinful. So a sinner doesn't enter into sin in a heroic manner. So we shouldn't at least feel that we're heroes because we can sin. It's really, sin is a matter of deception, just like it was for Adam and Eve, not a matter of heroics. He says that decisions to sin are made freely, but the act is actually a result of deception. So for those who argue about free will and sin and how do they work, I think Kierkegaard gives us this idea that, yes, we're totally free and we make a total free choice, but we're also under this cloud of deception. So we may be choosing, but are we choosing to be deceived is the question. And is that really what we could call free choice? It's a mirage that makes us think that everything was decided at the moment of resolution. We think that now we have made a commitment to God. And so the hard part's over. So once we make that commitment with God, the rest has got to be easy, right? Yes, we have come a long way. He agrees. Yes, of course, you've come a long way. You've gotten to the point, you've been confronted by God. You've been called by God, and you decide, yes, I want to commit my life to God. He says, but is really that it can be demoralizing to think that you've started out with such a good beginning, but you just don't realize you've entered into a long-term commitment. And this may be a reason why a lot of people fail, why their real Christian experience is short-term, because they've never learned that this is just the beginning of your commitment. And they expect, like Paul, they expect the blinding light, and a ministry and success from here on out, and financial rewards and all sorts of things, instantaneous Christianity, but it doesn't happen that way, at least according to Kierkegaard. But there he tells us, he says, there is a power in the resolution. A person who has already been through this will readily admit that life becomes a struggle after the commitment that one makes to Christ. It's then that remembrance of the commitment that helps us get through. And this is the power of the resolution. So the resolution does play a powerful role in faith. It's something to keep reflecting upon and say, wait, I gave my word to God. I committed myself. So I've got to remember that. That's got to be, even if nothing else works, sometimes we just have to go back to that beginning moment that we've made the commitment. So there is a better than not having a commitment. And then he gives us a quotation here. He says, do what you can do for God, and he will do for you what you cannot do.
That was my favorite quotation in this text.
Was it? Okay. I'm glad.
Yeah, I just want to read it again. Do what you can do for God, and he will do for you what you cannot do. And I looked it up. I think it originally comes from the King James, but it's not nearly as poetic as that idiomatic expression, which I guess was pretty popular at Kierkegaard's time. Have you ever heard someone say those exact words in your lifetime? Like maybe it was something that you encountered as a younger man, but I've never heard it put that way. And for some reason, it just stuck with me. And I think it's like poetic and true and also kind of corny at the same time.
Oh,
did it jump out to you at all?
No, it jumped out to me for a different reason. I don't remember this as a quotation at all until I actually read this. It reminded me of a quotation, do your best and God will do the rest,
yeah.
which is one that Kierkegaard does not agree with. This is close to that, but there's a little bit of a differentiation between them. It's a little bit like God helps those who help themselves or something to that effect. Yeah. Right. So we kind of have to be careful that we're not saying, well, God is happy with kind of a half, how can I say that? So a half commitment to God. That he's glad we do anything for him. He should be satisfied that, we're doing anything for him. That's not what this means here. This means that we do everything that we can. God will help us. there's going to be obstacles we're going to meet that we can't get beyond those obstacles, but God will help with those obstacles to get us beyond that. I think that's the God is trying to tell us here. Is that how you kind of take it?
Yeah.
Or do you take?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because especially with building something of the magnitude that I'm trying to build here with this project. Definitely confronted with limitations pretty frequently.
Yeah. We realize our limitations. Yeah. So he says we put ourselves into God's hands by making this resolution. Our commitment is not something that we submit to God for approval, but something that he submits to us. We want to make sure that, and I'm going to kind of reinforce this, even if Kierkegaard doesn't always say this, about the idea of a resolution with God, a commitment with God. It's not that we're saying, okay, God, this is what I'm willing to do, sign here. God is saying, this is what I want you to do, you sign here. So he's presenting us with the calling. He's presenting us with the commitment that he expects from us. And so we have to see it from that point of view. And that God is already committed to us through his promises. It's our commitment by which we express our belief in those promises. God makes promises to us. And it's up to us to decide, are we going to accept those promises? They may not have yet been fulfilled. Some of them may have been fulfilled. But God has always been one through the Old Testament to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, was to make promises to them. And then it was up to them to decide, do I believe in these promises? Do I trust in Yahweh? Do I trust in the Lord that he's able to accomplish these promises? So that's what we're confronted with our resolutions. It's not, again, we're creating a resolution and getting God to approve of it. It's that God is saying, I've made these promises. They're recorded in Scripture. Do you believe that I can do these promises? I promised that I would save mankind through faith. The New Testament is actually a new promise. I've promised that I would save you for eternity. Do you believe me? And that's the commitment that we're faced with. Do we really trust that God is telling us the truth, or is he lying to us, or any of other alternatives? God has made a commitment to man through the New Testament. Our commitment is only our agreement to accept it. He initiates the resolution, not us. So God is always in charge of this resolution. But we do get to respond to it and agree to it. So just to kind of bring us back to the Bible a little bit, in Romans 12:1, Paul gives us an idea of, well, what kind of a resolution is this? How much do I have to give to God? Is 10% enough? Is it tithing enough? Is this just a symbolic thing? I'll give God 10% of my life and he'll be happy with that much. Well, this is what Paul says. He says, I beseech you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. So for Paul, just our reasonable service is present ourselves as a living sacrifice. So if and when we make a commitment, that's the commitment that we're shooting for. Are we really willing to make ourselves as a living sacrifice to God? Just like the animals of the Old Testament offered in the temple. Of course, they didn't have a choice in the matter, but still they gave everything. They gave their entire life to be a sacrifice. So in the same way, we have to be willing to live or to commit ourselves to that point. Now he talks about something a little bit different, but now he's getting into cowardliness, which is what this actually is supposed to be about. He says it's the sign of a sophisticated age where sins and things forbidden are given absolution, which is forgiveness. And almost given an honorable name. It appears that he thought that the sophisticated ideal was to be permissive when it comes to behavior and sins, especially divine disobedience. it may be as it is today, where maybe even we honor those who have the courage to sin in spite of divine consequences, almost as though they were shaking a fist up at God and saying, I'm going to do this whether you like it or not. And we think they're heroic for standing up against God. They may cloak it by calling it the church, but in many times it's not the church that they're defying, it's God himself.
Do you have an example of that, Robert? Because I think it's an interesting thing to explore. I know that there are certain interpretations of figures from Scripture. Like I think about Jung's interpretation of Job, where like the way that Jung thinks about Job is actually being morally superior to God in some respect, is defying him, is protesting against him in some way. The way that he reads the book of Job, he reads the book of Job differently from Kierkegaard. I know, I don't know. I mean, or there's like, I think a lot of people who reject God don't necessarily reject God for cosmological reasons, but they reject God for the problem of evil. I think about maybe, I'm trying to think if it was in Crime and Punishment, where one of the Aloysia, or where one of the characters says, like, if pain is worth the gift of salvation, or something, if pain is part of the gift of salvation, then I just give it back, or something like that. Can you think of an example of individuals that seem to be in direct opposition to God that are made into heroes? And I mean, I think you and I are.
Sometimes we just have to go back to that beginning moment that we've made the commitment. So there is a better than not having a commitment. And then he gives us a quotation here. He says, do what you can do for God, and he will do for you what you cannot do.
That was my favorite quotation in this text.
Was it? Okay.
I just want to read it again. Do what you can do for God, and he will do for you what you cannot do. And I looked it up. I think it originally comes from but it's not nearly as poetic as that idiomatic expression, which I guess was pretty popular at Kierkegaard's time. Have you ever heard someone say those exact words in your lifetime? Like maybe it was something that you encountered as a younger man, but I've never heard it put that way. And for some reason, it just stuck with me. And I think it's like poetic and true and also kind of corny at the same time. Did it jump out to you at all?
No, well, it jumped out to me for a different reason. I don't remember this as a quotation at all until I actually read this. It reminded me of a quotation, do your best and God will do the rest, which is one that Kierkegaard does not agree with. This is close to that, but there's a little bit of a differentiation between them. It's a little bit like God helps those who help themselves, or something to that effect. Yeah. Right. So we kind of have to be careful that we're not saying, well, God is happy with kind of a half, how can I say that? A half commitment to God, that he's glad we do anything for him. He should be satisfied that, we're doing anything for him. That's not what this means here. This means that we do everything that we can. God will help us. There's going to be obstacles we're going to meet that we can't get beyond those obstacles, but God will help with those obstacles to get us beyond that. I think that's the gist of what Kierkegaard is trying to tell us here. Is that how you kind of take it?
Yeah.
Or do you take
because especially with building something of the magnitude that I'm trying to build here with this project. Definitely confronted with limitations pretty frequently.
Yeah. We realize our limitations. Yeah. So he says we put ourselves into God's hands by making this resolution. Our commitment is not something that we submit to God for approval, but something that he submits to us. We want to make sure that, and I'm going to kind of reinforce this, even if Kierkegaard doesn't always say this, about the idea of a resolution with God, a commitment with God. It's not that we're saying, okay, God, this is what I'm willing to do, sign here. God is saying, this is what I want you to do, you sign here. So he's presenting us with the calling. He's presenting us with the commitment that he expects from us. And so we have to see it from that point of view. And that God is already committed to us through his promises. It's our commitment by which we express our belief in those promises. God makes promises to us. And it's up to us to decide, are we going to accept those promises? They may not have yet been fulfilled. Some of them may have been fulfilled. But God has always been one through the Old Testament, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, was to make promises to them. And then it was up to them to decide, do I believe in these promises? Do I trust in Yahweh? Do I trust in the Lord that he's able to accomplish these promises? So that's what we're confronted with our resolutions. It's not, again, we're creating a resolution and getting God to approve of it. It's that God is saying, I've made these promises. They're recorded in Scripture. Do you believe that I can do these promises? I promised that I would save mankind through faith. The New Testament is actually a new promise. I've promised that I would save you for eternity. Do you believe me? And that's the commitment that we're faced with. Do we really trust that God is telling us the truth, or is he lying to us, or any of other alternatives? God has made a commitment to man through the New Testament. Our commitment is only our agreement to accept it. He initiates the resolution, not us. So God is always in charge of this resolution. But we do get to respond to it and agree to it. So just to kind of bring us back to the Bible a little bit, in Romans 12:1, Paul gives us an idea of, well, what kind of a resolution is this? How much do I have to give to God? Is 10% enough? Is it tithing enough? Is this just a symbolic thing? I'll give God 10% of my life and he'll be happy with that much. Well, this is what Paul says. He says, I beseech you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. So for Paul, just our reasonable service is present ourselves as a living sacrifice. So if and when we make a commitment, that's the commitment that we're shooting for. Are we really willing to make ourselves as a living sacrifice to God? Just like the animals of the Old Testament offered in the temple. Of course, they didn't have a choice in the matter, but still they gave everything. They gave their entire life to be a sacrifice. So in the same way, we have to be willing to live or to commit ourselves to that point. Now he talks about something a little bit different, but now he's getting into cowardliness, which is what this actually is supposed to be about. He says it's the sign of a sophisticated age where sins and things forbidden are given absolution, which is forgiveness. And almost given an honorable name. It appears that he thought that the sophisticated ideal was to be permissive when it comes to behavior and sins, especially divine disobedience. It may be as it is today, where maybe even we honor those who have the courage to sin in spite of divine consequences, almost as though they were shaking a fist up at God and saying, I'm going to do this whether you like it or not. And we think they're heroic for standing up against God. They may cloak it by calling it the church, but in many times it's not the church that they're defying, it's God himself.
Do you have an example of that, Robert? Because I think it's an interesting thing to explore. I know that there are certain interpretations of figures from scripture. Like I think about Jung's interpretation of Job, where like the way that Jung thinks about Job is actually being morally superior to God in some respect, as defying him, as protesting against him in some way. The way that he reads the book of Job, he reads the book of Job differently from Kierkegaard. I know, I don't know. I mean, or there's like, I think a lot of people who reject God don't necessarily reject God for cosmological reasons, but they reject God for the problem of evil. I think about maybe, I'm trying to think if it was in Crime and Punishment, where one of the Aloysia, or one of the characters says, like, if pain is worth the gift of salvation or something, if pain is part of the gift of salvation, then I just give it back or something like that. Can you think of an example of individuals that seem to be in direct opposition to God that are made into heroes? And I mean, I think you and I are on the side, but where we would obviously find that to be foolish, but maybe it would be worth exploring for a second if there is something, air quotes, heroic about what they're doing.
Yeah, I won't do any name calling because it's probably not right to do that. But there are people, celebrities, I think make it very obvious. They're idolized, they're made into heroes and heroines, even though their behavior is despicable. And it's because of that despicable behavior that people love them, because they're defiant and saying, I'm going against social mores, I'm going against what God says is sinful, and I'm going to do this anywhere. Nakedness, nudity, behavior, how can I say, a lot of sexual perversion, but it's all done as though it's heroic. And we should look up to these stars because they're stars. And so they're setting this pattern of behavior for everybody that the world just seems to love and idolize. I'm sure you can probably picture people right now doing such things. Just the Super Bowl halftime. I'm showing perhaps my naivete, but I can't watch halftime performances. I find them lewd, and I find them just unwatchable for my own sake. The way that the people behave on stage, and yet that's what's acceptable today.
I think I think that's a good point. I think the thing that I had more in mind is, I think we've talked about this before, is maybe someone like a Christopher Hitchens character who, proclaimed that God was not great because of the problem of evil. And he would say, I just can't believe in God because of the preponderance of evil or something like that. And they're out of principle just rejects God and would rather be apart from God than endorse one that has created a world where pain and what we think is evil exists. Do you think there's something heroic in like what Christopher Hitchens is doing, or do you think he's just totally foolish?
Well, I think that people who have a like mind, people who are atheists or even agnostics, might be looking for somebody to represent them, to stand up against the church or against God and represent them. I've watched some of the debates, between Christians and between atheists and stuff like that. And, I try to listen to try to say, what can I learn from both sides? I'm not there to put somebody down. I want to see what their point of view is because I want to have an answer. If an atheist challenges me with that point, how would I answer that? Because arguing with them is certainly not my approach. I would rather walk away than argue with somebody about, the existence of God or anything like that. That's not going to gain anything from that. But I've even known, and I understand the reason you're going there is because you're probably more philosophical than I am. I'm more maybe on the theological side, and so you see that happening in your world. But I can make it more personal. for me that the word sin is, I'm surprised it's going to still be in a dictionary maybe in another 10 years. People don't want to use that word sin anymore. It's kind of really gone out of use. And when I use the word, I usually get like a rolling of the eyes or sometimes laughter. And I've even been ridiculed when I use the word sin. And unfortunately, this even happens in church.
Yeah.
Sometimes when I've mentioned the word sin in church, I get kind of a laughter, like, come on, grow up, get with the age, get with things. We don't worry about that stuff anymore.
See, I used to be one of those individuals that laughed at the concept of sin, because I think it'd been sort of, there had been so many people that had, in the name of Christianity, gone around and just pointed a finger and called certain groups of individuals sinners, like people, I specifically, and I think the reason why this term has fallen out of fashion is and I want to make sure we don't get too political here. All right. Mm-hmm. And because I want to make this an inclusive conversation. And that's what I want Noetic to be. But I think there were a lot of people on the Christian right who went to great lengths to label the homosexual community as sinners, right? Mm-hmm. And what they did is they completely, it's the old saying of being able to recognize the sin of someone else but not in yourself, not looking at the totality of sin that every single individual has within them. And I think as I've read Kierkegaard more and understood his conception of the fall and sin as a form of despair, that is the separation from God that we experience during different existential stages, I've become more comfortable with sin. But if sin was just a word that evangelicals threw around to marginalize people of a different sexual orientation, and I don't want to get into a big conversation about that. I think that's part of the reason why the word sin, in my estimation, was taken to be a Looney Tunes word. But now I use sin all the time because I understand how sinful I am and how and I'm not even concerned about other people's sin. I'm not even really, because I have so much that needs to be taken care of.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. It's been misused and abused, the word. Yeah. Sin is not the act. Sin is what makes us act. And we have to see it as that. So by attacking a particular act, we're missing the point. Like you said, we need to look into ourselves. If that's our attitude towards sin, then we don't understand it.
Yes.
Sin is what, like you said, it's that state of despair. We have to get in deeper underneath what's making people do these things. Not so much if you stopped people from doing these things, they'd be righteous. That's not righteousness.
Right.
It's not stopping them from doing what they're doing. It's changing the inside of a person to give them different needs, different desires, different wants, right, different goals. So that's what I try to approach anyway when it comes to sin.
If we could perfectly socially engineer all of the country or whatever so that everyone behaves morally, there could still be sin going on within our breast. I'm currently prepping a seminar on Nathaniel Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown, and I found a quote that I particularly like. He goes into the he's during Puritan times, and he goes into the forest and meets a devil-like figure, and he realized there's like something. I haven't quite figured out the story, but there's a bunch of satanic stuff going on out there. But one of the things he says is, the fiend in his own shape is less hideous than when he rages in the breast of man. And I particularly like that quotation because it, like, the devil itself is not scary. Like the maybe even other people being the personification are not not scary. But what's really scary is the sin that that we are in the death throes of personally. Like I have sin. Like I'm very aware of my sins. And so was Paul. Like last week we talked about where sin, it was the paralytic effects of his ability to not forget how he persecuted people in the past. We've all got that thing in us.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Very well. Then now he continues on with cowardliness, and he compares it to pride. He says, let's say there's two words, and they mean something reprehensible, but the world doesn't consider them to be so. But the world doesn't consider them to be so. And two words he gives us is cowardliness and pride. So in Kierkegaard's mind, cowardliness and pride are both reprehensible, but the world doesn't particularly think this. And he gives an example. He says if he wanted to give a sermon, or if someone wanted to give a sermon about pride, he might have a big audience. A lot of people might show up, and Kierkegaard would be surprised by the fact of what they think pride is and why they're there. Many might think that pride is something flattering. It's a word that somehow is associated to bravery. I'm a proud individual. I have pride in my country, pride in myself. And so one might see pride as something positive. But what if we had a sermon on cowardliness? Would people show up for that? And the people who showed up, what would they expect to be hearing? How would they view cowardliness? Would they want to be related to cowardliness? Chances are no. But yet he says these are actually the same thing, pride and cowardliness, but people differentiate between them, where one becomes something good and the other one becomes something bad. He thinks that a sophisticated society has no problem with pride or being proud, but they have a big issue with being a coward. So he tells us again what I just said. He says that both words actually mean the same thing and that they're directly related, pride and cowardliness. But the world is deceived into thinking that they're different. So here's given us that idea of deception. How does the devil work with us? Well, he makes us think pride is okay, but cowardliness, no. Stay away from cowardliness, but pride is okay. And people kind of buy into that idea. So I kind of put together a little definition of pride and cowardliness, because I think at this point, just to make sure we're all on track, what we're talking about. Pride means that we have a high conception of our own worth. The proud person wants to become great and show off himself. He wants to do everything by himself so he can take all the credit. He sets the goal as high as possible to get the attention of others. And he rejects the world in that he thinks himself to be above all others. So this is kind of a composite definition of what things that Kierkegaard gave us throughout this discourse. And cowardliness, he says, is defined, it's the result of pride in that it's man's desire to preserve his pride. It determines what he will or will not do based upon the effects it will have on his ego or his pride. So he'll refrain from doing anything that threatens that self-adulation. So the two are related in that pride is what would we say, more the noun, and cowardliness is more the activity. It's that defense that we have to preserve the pride. So, and he's going to kind of give us, what did I say, illuminate that definition a little bit more as we go. But I thought we'd start with that so we kind of can tell where he's going. So I think he gives us next a religious view of cowardliness. I don't think he particularly puts it in that phrase, but I think this is his religious view of cowardly, how it relates to the religious person. Everyone is somewhat cowardly. Those who want to know themselves better have to admit of their cowardliness when it comes to suffering. So when it comes to suffering, it's kind of hard to get volunteers. I said, hey, do you want to volunteer to suffer? Probably not. So we're all cowards in that sense. We don't want to put ourselves out there to suffer. Kierkegaard's only concerned here again with that religious point of view. So we want to just try to stay focused there. And he says that it's this religious point of view is the only thing that can actually truly see through pride. The religious world knows that there's something that's needful taking place. If cowardliness could be seen as it truly is, they wouldn't want it. But it disguises itself as to something attractive. So it's like if we think in the terms of the devil, he doesn't say, well, I'm going to show you cowardliness as it really is, and then you choose. He's going to say, well, I've got cowardliness, but I can't show him it as it really is, so let me disguise it as something else. And the biggest danger of cowardliness is when it comes to making a resolution, especially with God. He uses the devil uses the weapon of time. He tells us, he says, there's no reason to hurry to make a resolution with God. You're still young yet. You got a lot of years in front of you. A lot of fun in front of you. Why spoil all your fun with making a commitment with God? So he kind of uses this element of time with the youth anyway, telling the youth that they should enjoy life first before they make any kind of a commitment to God. Cowardliness keeps people from acknowledging what's great, good, and noble. It hides what true bravery really is. So it disguises itself as bravery, as we talked about before, as being celebrity and having people admire you because you do these things that, we might label as sinful behavior, but because they're celebrities, we think it's something that we need to model. This is something great. But actually it's cowardliness. He says sometimes cowardliness tells us it's better, just keep striving, just keep trying. No need to make a commitment. Just keep trying to do your best all the time, and eventually you'll achieve it. Cowardliness encourages us to continue striving as though we have a real chance of achieving our goal, even if it's an infinite one or an eternal goal. So cowardliness tries to keep us from making a resolution. I don't need no resolution. I can do it on my own. I don't need to make a commitment. I don't need that moment of decision. I can do it just a little bit at a time. He says that's a deception. So in one sense, Kierkegaard tells us that we have to be careful about the resolution, but in the same manner, he says we shouldn't throw it out completely because it does have a value. Then he goes to what he calls the exceptional person. What if you're exceptional? Kind of like Luke, an exceptional individual, special talents, where things seem to be too easy for you, right, Luke?
Yeah, right. It's the Wizard of Oz over here.
Many times he says it's harder to make a commitment to something that appears easy. So you might say to yourself, this is too easy. I don't need a commitment. And this is so easy that the public isn't going to think anything big of me if I accomplish this. This is too small for me. I'm too smart. I'm too great to be able to take this as a project. So it's actually sometimes harder, he says, for a man of pride to do something easy. And what if you fail? What if you're a man of pride and ego and you do take an easy project and you fail? What does that do to your ego? So a lot of times people who have a big ego, they avoid taking on a big project. And then he says this, the cowardly, he says, takes sagacity or sagacity. Which is it?
I'm not the one to ask, but I usually say sagacity, but I butcher words all the time.
Well, we'll leave it with that since I don't know either. It means being a sage, saying very smart things of wisdom, sagacity. He says the coward has this on his side. In other words, he has the wisdom of the world on his side. The world is encouraging him with these little witticisms. It says that a person who begins nothing can lose nothing. That sounds pretty smart.
Yeah.
If you don't have anything, you're not going to lose anything. Why bother?
Yeah, that one really.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that passage really stuck out to me because I am constantly obsessed with. I think the thing that always perplexes me is why doesn't anyone do anything with their life? You were saying earlier that I think you were intimating that I had special talents or abilities or things came easy to me or something like that. And that is so far from the truth. I am so dumb. But I do have this mentality of like, I don't really have anything to lose, so I'll just go for it. But what I thought was really great about this particular passage of Kierkegaard's is trying to explain, like all around me, I see so many people who are so much more gifted than I am, but yet they never actualize their ability. And I thought this sort of spoke to that, to some, like we just live in a culture where everyone's so deathly afraid to risk anything, Yeah. They'd rather just be, they'd rather just be nothing.
Yeah, it's better to be a success, or at least have the perception of other people thinking you're a success, rather than destroy that by failure. So failure is something the devil uses to really make us not make a commitment or even start projects. I know a lot of people that are, much, much smarter than I am, but like you said, they don't do anything, and it's fear that stops them from doing it. They don't want to do something because they're afraid of failure. And I'm not really that much afraid of failure, because I'm kind of starting on the bottom, working my way up. They're already at the top and they're afraid of sliding down the hill, but I'm still, going up the hill.
How did you, because I think that's interesting. I think you and I share that quality, right? I think because
I do.
Yeah. So like a lot of people that do work for Noetic are individuals that I had to sort of like convince that this was like a great medium to convey ideas. But I found you on the internet. You actually started doing this before I did. I think you said you did like your first educational video back in like 2012 or something.
Yeah, probably.
Have you always been able to get over this fear of failure, or is that a recent thing? And I guess I'm just kind of curious what got you to the point where you're just like, you know what, I'm just going to go for it. I don't care what people think.
Well, when I was in college, I found it very difficult to raise my hand and talk, because as I started to do that, I would freeze. And I would like stop in a mid-sentence, and I'd forget, out of fear. I would forget what I wanted to say. And I mean, that was real paralyzing for me. And doing the videos was difficult. But these are not things that happened in isolation. It's not like one day I woke up and I said, I think I'll make a video. Over years, I was watching and listening and seeing other people and learning about God, learning about my faith in Jesus. And my experience was, why isn't anybody doing what they should be doing? Why aren't they saying the right things? There's so much more to my faith. Why isn't anybody doing anything about it? And finally, it got to the point where I would just have to say, God spoke to me, and he says, well, I am doing something. I'm making you.
Right.
So I saw that as, it's time to stop criticizing other people and stop saying, why aren't they doing something? It's time for me to step up and just get through it, make a fool of myself if that's what I have to do, but do it.
Yeah.
And so this is still the ongoing project, and the result of that resolution that I have with God to stop criticizing others for what they're not doing and do it myself. So I hope that answers the question somewhat.
That's a fantastic answer.
Okay. So he says, now here, this is an interesting part too. This kind of updates it to our time from Kierkegaard's time. Sagacity also says that we should mistrust everyone all of the time. This way we can never make a firm commitment to anything because no one is trustworthy. And I remember, I don't know if you watched much TV, but do you remember Dr. House? Everyone lies. Do you remember that expression?
It's interesting. I've never seen an episode of it. I think I understand the premise of the show. And what's really interesting and is that I don't know if it's a good or a bad thing, but people have said, when I used to teach at the university, people said I reminded them of him. Now, I have no conception of what that means. All I can deduce is that Dr. House is really smart, but also a massive jerk. So I don't know if I like that analogy. But so I've never seen the show, but I've had a number of people say, "Hey, you're like House," and I'm like, I don't know what that means, but thanks. I think.
Well, he's the kind of guy you almost wanted to hate, but you kind of loved him. So it's. I don't know if that helps or hurts, Luke. But then there was another TV show. Maybe you watched this. I really didn't watch it too much, but it's called X-Files.
Yeah, I saw that when I was a teenager. Yeah, I watched the X-Files.
Okay.
Yeah.
And wasn't the big thing on there is trust no one? Wasn't that the big?
Something like that, or I want to believe, or we're not alone. One of those slogans. Yeah, I think I remember Cancer Man, the informant that would tell them something like that, to trust no one.
Okay, so those are the two things. I tried to kind of update that. Everyone lies and trust no one, and that's what the coward says, because that way you don't need to make a commitment. Everyone lies, even God lies, I guess. Even scriptures lie, even the pastors lie, and people lie. Everybody's lying, so what's a commitment? No sense making a commitment. So those are things that prevent us. That's what he's trying to tell us. So under the topic of our goal, I have, we must live the good with an unselfish love as an unworthy servant. But even this love can be polluted by the temptation of profitability or of pleasing the crowd. So it seemed like in this discussion, in this discourse, Kierkegaard would get to a point where I say, okay, now finally he's past all the deception and all that stuff, and now he's finally getting into the good part where he's going to tell us what to do. But then as soon as he enters it, he slams the door again on me. He says, yes, you have to approach as an unworthy servant, but even then you can still get polluted. You can still be a failure by the temptation of profitability and pleasing the crowd. So we have to have self-control, which brings us back to that original scripture as one of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And this self-control tempers our effort in our resolution. So he says, of course, a resolution, there has to be a beginning in a resolution. And if there's no beginning, then there's no resolution. Then he brings up an example. Let's say engineers are talking about building a tower. And they decide, okay, how high do you want to build this tower? And the guy says, well, I don't know. How high do you want to build it? He says, well, I don't know. He says, as long as these engineers haven't come to a decision of how high the tower is going to be, there is no construction underway. You can't build a tower unless you first discuss how high it's going to be and make a decision. So he kind of likens a resolution to that same thing. And then he makes a comparison between the great and the small. He says, let's say one person is going to be great for God. He's going to do wonderful things for God. And another who says to himself, I don't have anything really to offer, and I'm really going to be more a burden on this project. than a help. Kind of like how I feel in this Noetic project. Going to be more the burden to others. But when both resolve to be all that they can be, he says, which tower is higher? Don't they both reach towards heaven? Don't they both reach towards the highest? So whether we have a lot to offer or whether we only have a little to offer, we can't use that as a reason to not want to do anything. That we have something to offer. So I was going to kind of give you an example.
Sure.
I hope I can get through this.
Sure. Take your time.
My wife was handicapped. And she kind of dealt with this issue. That she didn't have anything to offer people. And I told her that what she has is her bravery. That she goes through life every day, struggling, and yet getting through it. Mm. And when we taught the Bible study, people would tell her that. They'd say, yes, we admire you so much because we know how hard it is for you.
Yes.
And so that's kind of like what I can bring to the table today to say, if anybody out there is handicapped or anybody out there feels unworthy, that's not a bad thing. People will admire you for struggling through those adversities, for struggling through those difficulties. And that's greater than being somebody who has this great ability and uses it, but it's easy for them. So people will see that struggle. Go ahead.
Do you think her example is what inspired you to use your talents in this way, and that her influence lives on in that respect?
I think I deal with that every day, and I compare myself to that.
Yes. So obviously she set a very powerful example for you, and it's contagious because you're setting a powerful example for a lot of other individuals.
Yeah, it's been a motivation for me, and it's been something that won't let me give up.
Yeah.
If things get hard.
Yeah.
So
you were right to reassure her in that way.
Yes, I knew I was right. Yeah, that I had no doubt about. I wasn't just telling her something to make her feel good. I knew that people would see that struggle, and she just didn't really believe it until people started to tell her.
Yeah. And do you think she eventually came to know that?
Yes, I do.
You think it brought her comfort eventually?
Yeah, I do. I think
Good.
It made it easier for her to go, to have people see her with her disabilities. Because I think that's something that people with disabilities fear, is other people seeing it, other people staring, other people looking. It makes people feel uncomfortable. But that makes you stronger. That makes what you're doing even stronger. And that's what I kept trying to tell her and reassure her. So I think eventually it did stick.
Good. So, well, hopefully what you just said here, what's interesting, Bob, and I don't know if you know this about the work that you've done independently from when we started working together, is that a lot of people that the sorts of educational materials that we make are people who have disabilities of their own. Like, for instance, there are a lot of people who would love to go to college, like to go to their dream college, to go to Harvard or something like that. But maybe they got cancer, or maybe they're confined to a wheelchair and it's just, it logistically doesn't work for them. There are a lot of people that I hope benefit from the Noetic app and contribute to the Noetic app who are going through such trials in their life. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is, I don't know if you know this, but you probably spoke to a whole new generation of people who are wrestling with disabilities.
I hope so. I hope that can be helpful to them, because that's what we
Yes.
want to do here. This isn't just an intellectual property. I know
Yeah.
you reach out to people, and that's, I think, makes this very special, this project. Otherwise, I don't really think I'd be part of it, but I'm part of it for that reason as well.
Cool. Cool.
So we go back to the great and small. One who wins thousands to the gospel, and another who deals only with his own intellectual battles. His own internal battles. Which tower is higher? They both seek the kingdom. So whether you're a pastor and you're preaching to a mega church and you got 10,000 people attending, or whether you're an individual who is struggling with his own internal difficulties with sin and faith, both are presenting themselves as offerings to God fully. Let God will judge which one is going to get a greater reward, or which one is better. But we here on earth, we shouldn't do that. The person struggling with his own internal issues is just as strong as the person who struggles to try to teach 10,000 people. So nobody should be put higher than that. One might be deceived into thinking that one who has nothing or only a little can't give much. But I think we covered that quite a bit. Whatever you have, give it to its fullness, and it will be rewarded. Cowardliness prevents one from doing the good in the sense that he's resolved himself to do the good because he has a resolution, but he thinks it's finished. His resolution makes him superior to others without the resolution. One of the problems with making a resolution, if you don't make it with the right state of mind, and you say to yourself, well, I went to the Billy Graham, what is that called again? The Billy Graham sermons.
Jamboree. Yeah.
And I committed myself to Billy Graham's watchful eye. So, that makes me better than somebody who didn't do that. I made this grand resolution with God and somebody else didn't make it. So it feeds into my pride, into my ego. That's exactly the opposite of what Kierkegaard is telling us. Simply because we make a resolution does not make us better than anybody else. It's true, he says, that the resolution is important and that things are decided at that particular moment, but that's only the beginning. Once it's made, it changes into a concern for everyday matters. So that one moment of decision now transforms itself into everyday things. And I like to think of this kind of like the gym. You make that one commitment, you go and you pay your money and you got your gym pass and it tells you you're a member of the gym. That means now you go into part B is now go to the gym and do the everyday things, work out every day at the gym. And that's what he says a commitment is supposed to be like. It begins, with the membership pass. Okay, you're a member now, but now let's get to work. Let's do something. What does it mean that a person is capable of doing something great but is not capable of doing something insignificant? So what about a person who can only do something great but has a problem doing something insignificant? Many great men are not able to do the lesser things. No matter how high the resolution sounds, it could be simply a mirage. If one doesn't completely give himself to the good, both his strengths and his weaknesses. And again, when we take inventory of ourselves and we say, what's good about me? What's my strengths? Okay. What's my weaknesses? And not just give your strengths to God and say, okay, I'm going to give these things to God, but give your weaknesses as well. This is really powerful if people can grasp this idea. Weaknesses are only weaknesses in our eyes, in our mind. They appear as weaknesses. But to God, they don't. He gives us our weaknesses to make us strong. So that's we shouldn't judge ourselves too quickly on that. When we have to trust in that resolution. Don't contaminate ourselves by thinking that the one we're trusting is untrustworthy. In other words, if we're making a commitment to God, don't think God is untrustworthy. This has always been a comfort to me, because I believe God makes promises to me, and he, above all, can keep those promises. And so that's what keeps me going. It's not my commitment with God. It's not the power of my commitment. It's the power of God's ability to keep his promises that keeps me going.